Welcome to today's episode of People and Strategy. I'm your host, Mo Fatalbab, President of International Facilitators Organization. People and Strategy is a podcast from the SHRM Executive Network, the premier network of executives in the field of human resources. Each week, we bring you in-depth conversations with the country's top HR executives and thought leaders. For today's conversation, I'm excited to be joined by Liz Cotner, Director of Human Resources, Foster Swift Collins and Smith, PC. Welcome, Liz. We're also welcoming back Marjorie Morrison, SHRM's Mental Health Executive in Residence. Welcome, Marjorie. Warning, please be advised, this episode features potentially traumatic events, including workplace violence and suicide. To kick us off, Liz, I'd like to start with if you could tell us the story of your career journey.
Sure, absolutely. Hello, audience. Hi, Mo. Hi, Marjorie. Really excited to be here today talking about mental health. I began my journey 18 years ago at Henry Ford Health System in Detroit, and then I moved to General Motors. I've worked for CAE as well out of Montreal, and I've worked also for a couple of other mid-sized companies, and most currently the head of HR at Foster Swift Law Firm out of Lansing, Michigan.
Well, that is a great career. Let's dig into it a little bit more. So one of your passions, Liz, is mental health. Why is this such an important topic to you?
Mental health has been a part of my whole journey in life, personally and professionally. So my personal journey is actually in regards to my mom. So 6 years ago, unfortunately, my mom committed suicide. And for her entire existence, for 60 years, so she was 60 when she passed away, she struggled with 4 different mental health conditions. She struggled with manic bipolar depression, anxiety, depression in general, and at the end, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so growing up in a household where my mom often was having emotional outbursts, she screamed and yelled all the time, was really traumatic. At a young age, by the time I was 5, I realized, my mom wasn't, end quote, a normal mom. She came with challenges that I wasn't born to deal with, right? And so, unfortunately, my mom did also experience 2 divorces, and that didn't help. That, compressed the depression and anxiety. There was a time when I was a senior in high school that she tried to commit suicide in her home, and I had to call 911. And I remember just shaking. I've never had to call 911 before, let alone for my mom who was trying to kill herself. She had locked herself in the master bedroom in her home in Troy, Michigan. And I remember getting off the phone and just shaking, just continuously calling my grandparents lived around the corner and saying, Granny, my mom's trying to commit suicide, not even really understanding, right? At 18, I had no idea. I didn't have any professional training. I didn't come with a background in that, had not been in the workforce just yet, hadn't even gone to college yet. And that was just a big moment for me, a pivotal moment in my personal life.
Wow.
And, unfortunately, down the line, she ended up, proceeding forward with a suicide and had completed that. And, again, now I was much older in life. I was in my mid-30s. And still, when you get that phone call that, your mom's dead, she killed herself, I remember my whole body and my ears just went silent. Like I couldn't hear. I was in the middle of Target buying backpacks for the Sarasota Police Department to administer to the local children. It was like back, almost back to school. And that moment also life-changing, right?
Of course. Liz, first I want to thank you for your courage to share something so personal with our audience. And it's obviously very touching. How did you cope with all that growing up?
It was a lot to deal with. Again, no instruction manual. Nobody says, hey, here's a book on how to handle a parent who had multiple mental health conditions. The first coping mechanism, and I still use it today, is actually listening to music. I took that a step further and was a college radio DJ in undergraduate studies. And that really helped me too. As my mom progressed in her own adulthood, her conditions became significantly severe. Her mental health conditions were the brain, and Marjorie's going to, of course, touch on it from a clinical standpoint. It's the brain just, was challenged, if you will. And so music, really coped with music. Spent a lot of time playing sports, really enjoyed playing sports, running, tennis, volleyball, cheerleading, all the things growing up, right? Close support system. So I was really lucky that I had grandparents that were around the corner. My dad served as a confidant. I'm an only child. So when I turned 16, I stayed out of the house as much as I humanly could. I wasn't home very often. And I made sure that the college I chose was over 3 hours away so that she couldn't have access to me, and that I could have some space to grow up and enjoy that college journey. So those are the top 3 things that I used to really get me through some of those tougher times.
Thank you, Liz. Marjorie, from a clinical perspective, what are some coping strategies that you can suggest to our audience?
First of all, Liz, I echo Mo, and thank you so much for your willingness to share your story and to be so vulnerable. And those are really hard things. I appreciate how you said you knew at an early age, like at 5, that this didn't feel normal, and probably because you would see other kids and know that what you're experiencing at home was different. So that's always a really good sign when you're able to see something sort of like and separate yourself from it. So just knowing that you had that early age experience shows why you've been, resilient through these things. I always say when it comes to coping, it's exactly what you just said. It's whatever feels right for you. So if it's music, I also love music. That's very calming for me. Activities, things like that. I think what's another way maybe to think about it too is what we can do, especially in HR or as people leaders. What could we do when people come to us having just been through something traumatic or sharing something traumatic? I can kind of share some of those thoughts if that's okay. I think that one thing that I have found is that we want to create an environment where people feel comfortable. And so sometimes it's just using as sort of cliche as this is, a very like respectful tone, just being able to not be condescending, but at the same time, being able to share some gratitude. I often say when someone shares something personal with you, it is the greatest gift or compliment they can give you. That means you're creating an environment where they feel safe. So normalizing it. It's really important to have clear boundaries. We are in the roles that you guys are working in, Liz and all of our audience. There's always a gray line. It's always a little bit fuzzy, and it's not black and white. So it's really important to say things like, I want to support you the best I can, but I'm not a therapist. My role is to help connect you to appropriate resources. Those boundaries are really important. And I talk a lot about empathy, but empathy is so critical. So being able to say things like, I hear this has been really challenging for you, or, again, the gratitude, thank you for being open with me, and maybe bringing it a little bit back to like work, is this something, can you tell me more about it and how it might be, impacting you at work, to kind of keep that conversation back? Because I think the key in this is showing empathy, but not being a therapist. And so being able to kind of have that somewhat of a boundary.
Thank you, Marjorie. So a question that is coming up for me naturally around this is, what happens if you are an HR or CHRO and somebody comes to you and expresses suicidal ideation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have had that in my career before, where I did have an employee, unexpectedly arrive in my office and had said that he had attempted suicide at home. And I'm thankful for a couple things. I'm thankful that he came forward. That's not easy. We talk about vulnerability and empathy and some gratitude in there too, as Marjorie touched on. I'm thankful that he could trust me enough and that his colleagues had actually encouraged him to come to HR. And so I'm so glad that he did. He's with us today. So outcome good. That's good. And when he sat down, I'll never forget how there was such shame on his face and fear. You could just see the fear and shame. And so one thing as an HR practitioner, we always want to look at body language. We talk a lot about that in the interview process, but then there's that transition to the real world practice. Now the employee's in the seat. Now I need to be attuned to that skill, right? And so when he sat down, I immediately could tell, okay, we have a situation here. My first thought was, do I need to call 911? What's the level of emergency? So also as an HR practitioner, we're assessing risk clinically too. Okay, what's the risk? Do I need to have some additional practitioners on back line, right? And so some of the questions that I had asked is, can you help me understand how you're feeling right now? I love asking, can you help me understand how you're feeling right now in this moment? Because in 2 minutes down the line, his life could have been gone. So let me capture the real emotion right now. And so he was able to tell me, right now, I don't feel so good about myself and I'm feeling suicidal. Okay, next step. Now I'm going down kind of the 5 whys, which, is a Toyota model on there too. And okay, so, why might you be feeling this right now? And then he was able to, again, take me down the pathway. And what we ended up doing is excusing him for the rest of the day. So we offered him a couple resources. We extended FMLA. We extended short-term disability, ADA, all of those great immediate resources. I knew he had been with he had been with the company for over a year. So I knew his tenure, so I could extend those resources. I also really demonstrated curiosity, and this is something I really want our audience to know, is that there's such a stigma, right, around mental health. There are a lot of there's a band of emotions, right? There's anger and shame and hurt and fear and sadness and depression and feeling worthless, and loneliness is really physical. And so it's really also assessing those emotions and being able to put the resources in front of an employee and saying, have you tapped into resources? Are you open to resources right now? Because we don't ever want to push somebody that might be feeling suicidal or just really not feeling good in here. I don't ever want to push.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. And we're going to get to your curiosity model shortly. I want to hear from Marjorie, just from the clinical perspective again, and what happens when you think somebody has suicidal ideation, and what do you recommend?
Yeah, one of the first things is there's this fallacy, which is that if you ask someone, are you thinking about taking your life, that you're going to put that idea in their head. And research has actually shown that that is not the truth, that people want you to ask, because if it is in their head and it is something that they're thinking, they're much more open to share. There are it's a critical moment. And Liz, I think it again goes to the way people feel comfortable around you and their willingness to talk and open up. One of the first things you want to do is you want to ask questions like, have you thought, you can ask this question, have you thought about how you would do it? And these are things that make it more imminent. So the questions you want to know is, do they have a plan? And then do they have the means to execute on that plan? Right. So if it's like, I would shoot myself, and then do they have access to a gun? Right? Those are now makes that risk even higher. So it's really important that you're assessing it. And then you do need to bring in immediate help. We have different types of things where we say, but somebody who shares that they're feeling actively suicidal is somebody who does need immediate help. And if they're resistant, you can do in I think every state, a 72-hour hold. And that's, and you might feel that that's overkill, but if you start to talk to the person and they're sharing with you that they do have a plan, they do have the means, you are going to need to kind of put protect them and, find whether or not they have a family support system. Is there someone there? Or do you need to do a short-term stay just to diffuse the situation? A lot of the time, I won't say most, but a lot of the time, people are really receptive and grateful for that intervention. It's not typically seen as something that is like, no, this is overkill. Usually people are really struggling when they're going to that point that they're sharing it. And it's not uncommon. I've had a lot of HR people share with me over the years that an employee comes to them and says, I attempted suicide over the weekend, or I've been thinking about it, or things like that.
So I think for our audience, that's a really great question. Do you have an action plan? Because what I found with my experience personally is that the individual may not truly want to die. They just want their pain to end. We do have employees in the workforce, whether we know it or not, that might be going home to domestic violence and abusive cases. They're bringing that to work, but you would never know, right? How would we know? And so this is the time more than ever to ask those curiosity questions, which we'll get to momentarily, and that Marjorie touched on as well, is asking direct questions, curiosity questions. Do you have a plan? Most times they do, because they've been thinking about it because they just want the pain to end. And I really want our audience to know that and how that feels. That can't feel good, living with that pain day in and day out.
I often say that suicidal ideation is like being in a very dark cave. You feel really trapped and there's like no way out. And every sort of option or opportunity is a ray of light. So if you think about it as like a hole in that cave gives some light to, oh, I can get out of this. And so the more sort of options you can also take with someone, if you're feeling, comfortable with them and you've mitigated the situation, to start thinking about, what other options are there to get out of this really dark place. All of those, that's for all of us with everything, right? When we're feeling totally overwhelmed, the best remedy for that is thinking about these different kinds of options that can really make us feel like we have some power back, that we have some control back, and that, we can sort of set a new course. But you are right. It's a devastating place to be.
So the curiosity model, I'm curious.
Yeah, I know. Let's keep curious. So how did I arrive at a curious framework? So I want to share with our audience, and flipping the page to the professional side. My first exposure to psychiatric services was I was an HR intern 18 years ago, and Henry Ford Health System had contracted with Select Specialty Hospital. We had a psychiatric emergency department where I worked closely with our employees. And how they, went through the intake process. Frontline workers that we just don't even think about. And I want our audience to remember they're frontline workers, right? So my curiosity began because of my experience at home. And then I had exposure in the workforce, right? Instead of thinking, wow, I'm not going to do anything about this, I became curious. And then as I, transitioned into leadership roles, I had an experience with a workplace shooting in 2017 at Zoto Beach Resort in Longboat Key, Florida, where a gunman came in and shot and killed two of my employees, the night auditor and the other security guard. And getting that phone call at 6:38 in the morning changed my whole life. And my general manager at the time had said, Liz, there are two dead bodies in the lobby. I need you to get in here. It took me 3 years to not hear that phone call in my ear. Right? I had some PTSD from that. I went into grief counseling myself. I want to share with our audience, there's no shame in that. There is no shame as a HR practitioner or a leader or a CEO, anybody in a leadership seat that needs that help, please seek it. And I was very thankful I had a local counselor that helped me walk through and unwind that 14-hour day. And so these lived experiences have really, fostered a mindset of curiosity.
Thank you, Liz. Marjorie, any thoughts on the PTSD part of this? Because I think that's an important and potentially overlooked aspect of mental health and coping.
Yeah, Liz, wow, you've really have seen a lot. And I think most people are fortunate, hopefully, to live their life and not have that, but it can really change the course of someone's life. I've spent many, many years working with the military, and PTSD, as you mentioned, it's very, very real, and it can be triggering at a lot of different times. I think what's really so important, and we all know this in HR, and as I'm like really getting to know so many great, all of these amazing people that you all are doing this work that's so hard, is that people come in to work with their own sort of traumatic backgrounds. And in some cases, and just so you know, PTSD is what happens when after 6 weeks, you still have symptoms. That's when it turns into what we actually call the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress. But prior to that, we can have a acute stress, a reaction to a very stressful event. That's a very positive thing. You don't really want to be in a situation, as you can imagine, where something very traumatic like that happens and you're not affected by it, right? Like we are supposed to be, as human beings, we react to things. So I think it becomes an issue when that time goes on longer than goes on longer, recovery takes longer, and it starts to really impact you in different ways. And so I would say, like, for all of you in these roles, it's really important to be thinking about different signs that you would see people that may be experiencing some kind of trauma. And it's a little bit challenging because it isn't just one thing, because you have physical signs. So you'll see sometimes it could be fatigue or exhaustion, headaches, stomach issues, changes in sleep, difficulty sleeping or oversleeping. You'll see sometimes visible things like weight loss or weight gain. Then you have emotional signs. So things like persistent sadness, irritability, feelings of hopelessness, being overwhelmed, kind of a sense of not a lot of satisfaction in work or accomplishments, things like that. Emotional numbness. You'll hear people say, I don't feel like I feel anymore. But then there's also behavioral and cognitive signs. So I was thinking it's behavioral, cognitive, emotional, physical. Behavioral signs are things like seeing people withdraw from social interactions, having a hard time concentrating. Obviously, you touched earlier on substance use, this increase, relying on substance use. And, at work, we'll see it with decline in productivity, right? Missing deadlines and things like that. And with cognitive, it's also important, think about focusing, memory problems, negative talk, persistent worry. We will see that in people manager roles, right? Because you start to see people just sort of not track on things, and you're like, wait, we just talked about that, and you don't remember that was supposed to be delivered. All of those are really important signs that you could look at to realize that someone might be struggling or having some kind of PTSD symptoms.
Yeah, thank you. So for CHROs who want to prepare for unexpected workplace trauma, what do you advise for them?
So coming back, Mo, you had asked me about that curious framework, and this is where I want to deliver the framework to our audience. So I think of ensuring that as a CHRO, CEO, thought leaders in the seat, or people managers in general, using the acronym CURIOUS. And let's break that down together. So C stands for, can you help me understand what it's like to live with your current condition? U stands for understand that the receiving individual who's going through a mental health either crisis or has a condition may not want you to take immediate action. And this is outside of maybe suicide. So we're thinking of somebody who maybe they just lost a baby. Maybe their parent just passed away, some grief, some deep sadness. Understand that your role may not be immediate action. R is for recall a time when maybe you didn't feel so good, or you were experiencing some trauma in your life, and how would you want to be received, and what type of support was helpful for you. I stands for, is there another time in your life where maybe you've experienced this before? Helping the individual that's, right in front of you claw back. you know what, I have gone through this before. Maybe a coping mechanism like a support system, music, some type of activity, might help me in this moment where I'm not feeling so good. O stands for open-ended questions. Let's remember, audience, we want to ask those open-ended questions. Really important. U stands for understanding not to ask too many questions, right? So bombarding somebody that's in front of you outside, again, of suicide may not be able to answer more than 2 or 3 questions. And lastly, and curious, the S, stay silent. So when the other individual is releasing their thoughts, it's easier said than done. Staying silent is very hard because our human intuition, we want to help. We want to give to somebody that needs our help.
Yeah. Thank you. Marjorie.
Well, first of all, I love that. And I love how people can create order to chaos, right? Liz, that's like a perfect example of what you did. You've been through these traumatic events and then you created your own framework for it, which is great. And I often talk a lot about listening and the key to really being there for someone who's listening, which I think you put in the context of silent. But I love that because I think that that's such a beautiful way to go. I think it's important to think about a traumatic type of event can be a suicide, like we talked about, can be a workplace violence, but it can be other things too. Even like a lot of reorg, sudden layoffs, things like that can really create traumatic events. And so I've been very passionate about this, really being proactive. It's important to have a plan, to be prepared, have a plan. What is that plan going to be? And establish really clear policies with that, be able to communicate with it, and then be able to give people roles of what happens. Take care of the, whatever basic needs are there. I mean, this is a time when employers kind of really need to show up. And then, really conducting that debrief is so important. I spent many of my early years of training in San Diego. And as a school psychologist, I did unfortunately have to work with school shootings. Within 2 to 3 days, you really need to get in there and conduct a debrief, provide ongoing, psychological support, really have that leadership, be visible. And you want to see how people are doing, really kind of monitor how they're doing, and then put in flexible workplaces or work situations if that would be helpful.
Thank you, Marjorie. Liz, I want to close with our last question, our typical closing question. What is one piece of advice that has shaped your work or personal life?
The one piece of advice that has just stuck with me and probably will for the next 2 decades and a half of my career is words have meaning. Words really have meaning. So what we say really means something to the person receiving it or the audience or the greater good if we're doing a speaking engagement. And so I hope our audience, has had a good experience listening to Marjorie and I, but words have meaning.
Thank you. Thank you both for sharing your wisdom. And Liz, thank you again for sharing your such intimate story and vulnerable story with us. And that's where we'll end it for this episode of People in Strategy. You can follow the People in Strategy podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also, podcast reviews have a real impact on podcast visibility. So if you enjoyed today's episode, leave a review to help others find the show. Finally, you can find all our episodes on our website at shrm.org/podcasts. Thank you for listening and have a great day.
SHRM.